afternoon, evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thanks for joining our Employment Law in Europe overview today. My name is Andrew Lang. I'm a business manager with Unitera. I'm our kind of boots on the ground out here in the United States. Most of our other team is in the UK. I've also got Julian Christmas here, who's our Chief Revenue Officer, and he's going to be helping me give the presentation today. So just to give everyone, if you're not familiar with Unitera, just to give you a quick introduction on who we are and what we do. We help our clients expand internationally, whether that be U.S. outbound, U.S. inbound, not involving the U.S. at all. We take care of a lot of the back office services that companies, tend to struggle with when they're expanding abroad, and kind of help them understand and work through what they don't know. So that's stuff like HR, payroll, compliance, financial reporting, and more. So any questions you have on Unitera, feel free to get in touch with me. But I'm going to move a little quick here through the introductions because we've got a lot to go over today. We're just going to give a really high-level overview of some of the topics that, in our experience, have been important to our clients in understanding European employment law, payroll in Europe, establishing in Europe, that kind of thing. If you have any questions, we'll have a Q&A toward the end. We're going to try to save about 10 minutes of this half-hour presentation for a Q&A. But if there's a question that's too complex, feel free to put it in the chat anyway. Any questions you've got, put in the chat, and if it's too complex, I'll reach out to you afterward. So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So I wanted to start with a quick introduction of why companies do business in Europe. A big reason is the EU is the largest unified economic zone in the world. It's made up of a bunch of member states, and they're the second largest economy in the world together, behind the US. That's an estimated about 22% of the global economy. There's specialized tech hubs and skilled workforces, all throughout Europe. Different countries have different specializations and things, but biotech, telecommunications, and IT, and somewhere like Spain, aerospace specializations. I know France has a really strong aerospace workforce, but the EU also supports its members with education and making sure their member states are performing well with their education. So very highly skilled workforce in many places in Europe. Mobility between EU countries makes it easy for employees to travel, makes it easy to hire and kind of set up a base of operations in Europe, and then expand outward from there. And we'll go over that in a little more detail later. But, very easy for people to move about, for trade to happen between the member countries. And then taking advantage of quality gaps in services and products. There's a lot of Europe that's still developing. The Baltic states, really comes to mind. But that's really an opportunity for foreign firms to jump in and provide products and services that either may not be available or may not be up to the level of what they can provide. So that's, kind of a high-level overview of why companies tend to go into Europe. There's a lot of different reasons, but these are kind of the main important ones that we wanted to hit. Some considerations while employing in Europe. So this is we split this into things that must be done, and then things that are nice to have. If you want to be competitive in Europe, or if you want to have a well-defined strategy for expanding and going outward into different parts of Europe, or even using it as a base for launching into other parts of the world. Must-haves, a payroll registration. So whether that be registering your domestic company, whether that be US or elsewhere, as an employer, that's a possibility in some European countries. You can also use an international PEO or employer of record service. They've got their own payroll registration that they would hire your employees under. Or what Unitera tends to focus on, and what we see as a really compliant solution is establishing an entity in the country, and that comes with making the payroll registrations. Compliant employment contracts are important, so we'll go over this in more detail later. Julian will help, but that's going to be paying attention to local regulations, EU regulations, things like language, collective bargaining agreements all play into that. Knowledge of local and federal payroll requirements. This can get really complicated country by country. Some of the tax registrations and the way tax is levied is different in different countries. Really important to have experts who, especially if you're not familiar with European law, experts who can help you jump into that stuff and remain compliant. And then statutory benefits in a lot of places in Europe, it's different country by country, even municipality by municipality sometimes. But statutory benefits are required to be provided by employers. And again, helpful to have someone who knows what they're doing and can keep you compliant there. Nice to haves are supplementary benefits. So these are things that can differentiate your company from other employers. And we'll get into a little bit of those and go over those country by country a little later. But those are just kind of nice things to have that employees typically negotiate contracts on that employers should be aware of. Employing through a legal entity can have its own advantages, and this mitigates your permanent establishment risk, which is the risk that the government's kind of not getting a piece of your business, and you could be exposed to penalties or liabilities arising from employing people through a non-compliant option. Unlimited PTO is a thing in Europe, very popular here in the US, but you have to be careful in Europe because there are statutory minimums. And even though the EU is one economic zone, each country has different minimums that need to be observed and need to be given to employees and adhered to. So with that, I'll pass it on to Julian to talk about payroll and what some of the differences between Europe and other countries may be that are good to be aware of.
Andrew, so hi everybody, Julian Christmas here, Chief Revenue Officer of Unitera, and thanks for the intro and the background, Andrew. The HR landscape in Europe is very complicated and it's very different from, a lot of the work we do is for US companies expanding into Europe, and European employment law and the payroll landscape is not only very different between the US and Europe, but actually I think often what is lost is that there are huge differences from one European country to the next. So what we're trying to do with this presentation is really just highlight some of the differences, and I think a lot of people appreciate that there are differences. We really can't cover them all, but just to highlight and try and inform a little bit about what are the factors and what are the considerations that make the broad concept of employing people in Europe so different from the US and other parts of the world. So hence it's high level by definition. We're not covering everything, but hopefully this just informs and helps people understand really some of the high level differences. So looking at the broad concept of employing and payrolling people in Europe versus the US. Key difference, and this is a very fundamental one, and it comes up again and again, is the difference between at-will employment, which is how employment works in the US, versus contract employment in Europe, and in fact most of the rest of the world. The idea that in the US you can employ at will, but you can also terminate employment more or less at will. It's in terms of offer letters and the documentation that sits behind an employment arrangement is very simple. In Europe, employment contracts are critical documents. They can run to 20 or 30 pages. They need legal input. They're very complex. And it's really important to understand the importance of fully compliant employment contracts for all employees, and they're as different between European countries as they are between any given European country and the US. So the concept of contract employment is very important. Collective bargaining agreements. So not all countries have collective bargaining agreements, but as a concept, it's helpful to understand. And the idea is that as well as headline employment law in a country such as France or Spain, there are also collective bargaining agreements which provide special additional employment terms and conditions for employees, maybe in a certain sector, or maybe in a certain role, or maybe in a certain role in a certain sector. And each employment needs to be assessed for which collective bargaining agreement applies, if one applies at all. And that's important, and that's usually conducted by an employment lawyer in France for France or Spain or the relevant country. So collective bargaining agreements are a critical difference. Probation notice periods. So notice periods in Europe tend to be long, and certainly a lot longer than our US clients are used to. So notice periods average for sort of professional workers would average 3 months. For executive levels, it could be as much as 6 months. But anyway, it's seldom less than a month. During a probationary period, so that the early months of employment, the notice period can be shorter. So a typical arrangement might be that for a 6-month probationary period, an employee can be terminated at 2 weeks or a month's notice. But once they pass their probationary, then they would switch to the full notice period, which is reflected in the employment contract. Local language requirements are important to understand. So in some countries you can have an English language employment contract, but in many countries they have to be in local language. You can have a dual language contract, so it can be in English and, for example, German, but it's important to understand that the German language part of the contract is the legally binding part, and the English language piece is generally just for information. It's also some quirks of, for example, French employment law are that everything has to be conveyed in French language, and that sometimes anything that's conveyed in English language, perhaps informally by email, can be invalidated simply on the basis that it's been conveyed in English language. So it's important to sort of capture and understand the language requirements. Payslip requirements. So countries also have very specific payslip requirements. France comes up again and again as an example. A French payslip is very complex, but one thing that a French payslip has to capture is the employee's leave allowance at the beginning of the month, the movement in their leave during the month, and then their balance carried forward. And it can cost a company, it can cost in financial terms if that is not observed. So each country has its own specific requirements around payslips. Monthly payment in arrears. So it's traditional and normal in Europe for employees in all European countries to be paid monthly in arrears. I do have discussions with clients who are interested in paying bi-monthly, which I know is usual in the US and usual in Canada, but it's absolutely not normal in Europe, and it certainly wouldn't be expected. Many countries have kind of quirky rules around holiday pay and strange patterns of salary payments. So, for example, in Italy, typically an annual salary is carved into 14 amounts, and 2 months of the year are paid double. So essentially there are 14 pay periods in Italy. That can be dealt with and reduced down to 12 as long as it's addressed properly in the employment contract. But people need to be aware that these sorts of quirks exist. A comment on bonus pay, because this comes up again quite frequently in discussions with clients. In Europe, broadly, bonuses and other payments or commissions that go through payroll are simply taxed as an extension of salary. So I know in the US that bonuses are taxed in a different way. In the in the UK and the rest of Europe, if employees are paid a bonus, then tax and social security apply as if it was simply a higher salary month. Every country has its quirks. I flagged some of them. Most European countries have their own quirks. Some of them are very quirky. Italy, I've already flagged a couple of strange treatments in Italy, Spain and France as well. Every country has its quirks, and it's really important to get the right advice up front. The employment contract piece is important, but it's also important to understand the quirks of payroll, because as I flagged on the French example, if you don't follow or don't anticipate the strange things that come up, it may end up being more expensive for you as an employer. So moving on, employment contracts specifically, such a critical area. The employment contract is the legal document which governs the employment relationship between the employer and the employee, and it's legally binding and steeped in employment law and employment legislation. So There is no such thing as a European employment contract. Each country has its own employment law, which captures country-specific employment law and certain aspects of EU law. So an employment contract for a given country needs to capture and observe all of that. It's really, really important. Many times I've spoken to companies who say, "Hey, Julian, we need to run a payroll in Germany. We're very excited. We just hired a guy in Germany, but we wanted to do it super quickly, so we just gave him a US offer letter." Understanding that a US offer letter is not compliant is one thing, but also understanding the implications of taking on employees without an employment contract in place. Clearly, from a legal perspective, you as an employer don't have any protection from anything really, based on the fact that there's no legal contract in place. I'm conscious of time, so I know we need to move on, but this employment contract piece is really core. Candidates won't generally resign until they have a contract in place with the new employer, so don't expect European employees to resign their current post until you've been able to give them a fully compliant contract and have that signed off and in place. Collective bargaining agreements, they need to be reflected in the employment contract. So again, it's an important step to understand that if a country has a regime of collective bargaining agreements, that assessment needs to be made in advance and it needs to be incorporated into the agreement. To add complexity to the collective bargaining agreement, some countries have different classifications of employees. So an example is in Italy, where there are 4 categories. The only ones we really come across are the top 2. So there's an executive level employee, which is a dirigente, and a sort of middle manager level, which is a quadro. And the classification of employee needs to be determined, and the employment contract then needs to work that in and reflect it in the verbiage and all the information in there. I mentioned dual language contracts, so they are a thing, but it's important to note that local language always prevails. And just in terms of points of negotiation, what do broadly European employees typically try to negotiate on? Of course, they negotiate on salary. Of course, they negotiate on stock options. They'll often try to negotiate on their PTO level. Because they will often, as a senior employee, they'll enjoy or will be used to enjoying a higher than statutory level of holiday allowance. Some will try to negotiate on pension contributions. I was just on a call with a client talking about that a moment ago. And so there are various areas. In some countries, they will try to negotiate a car allowance. I have to say, broadly speaking, car allowances are kind of a thing of the past. And if anybody experiences a prospective hire who is after a car allowance, generally speaking, it's quite easy to avoid that through negotiation. So that's kind of a high level view of some sort of interesting aspects of employment and employment contracts in Europe broadly, which would be very different to the offer letters that our clients are used to issuing in the US and in other parts of the world as well. A very different sort of landscape. So if we can move on, Andrew, to the next slides. So termination of employees in Europe. Hiring is great, but we all have to understand, and in fact we support we support our clients quite frequently with the unfortunate situation where employees have to be terminated. So some thoughts on that. So employment at will versus contract-based employment. Employment at will, as I mentioned, is sort of like termination at will as well. Whereas, I know that typically, say in the US, I don't believe that there is a sort of statutory notice period at all. I know most employers usually offer sort of a couple of weeks to allow a handover and for goodwill. Whereas, with European contract-based employment, it's the notice period is governed by the details of the contract, and as I say, classically 3 months for a reasonably senior employee is not unusual. So you either have to stick with an employee throughout the notice period, or as is often the case, put them on notice and then allow them to take their notice period as gardening leave, which I know is a sort of a European concept. Terminating employees, it's important, critically important, to understand that if you want to terminate an employee, in really any European country, there is always a process that has to be followed. Some countries it's more complex than others, but there is always a process that has to be followed. And not following that process is probably, in my experience, the most common reason why employees go to litigation on the basis of contravening employment law. And that's the next point. Litigation can be high in some countries, and it's usually, as I say, because the process hasn't been conducted properly. I was involved with one recently where we advised a client on a French termination. We provided the paperwork for the termination of the French employee, and our client used the same paperwork to manage the termination of a German employee. So the paperwork wasn't compliant with the German legal requirements, and so the employee went into litigation, and we're now managing that on behalf of our client. So it's a false economy to not take legal advice and follow due process on the termination of employees in Europe. So compromise agreements are a common aspect of that, frankly, which is that an outgoing employee can be asked to sign a compromise agreement, which essentially will waive the employee's right to go into litigation or to make a claim against the company. And in return, the company usually will make a payment to the outgoing employee as a sort of compensation for agreeing not to make any claims. Again, notice periods typically very common, 3 months, but can be as high as 6 months for senior employees. Next, Andrew. So nicely timed, actually. We've got 7 minutes left. So very quickly, just want to run through 4 countries which are very common. They're countries where we provide our clients with a lot of support, and just to sort of highlight a few interesting factors about those countries. So, typifying the UK in terms of the employment landscape, employment law I would typify as being really well balanced between the employer and the employee. So in the US, I tend to think that it's very stacked in favor of the employer because of the employment at will arrangement that prevails over there. In the UK, there's quite a nice balance between employer and employee, and then you move further down the spectrum to countries like France and Spain, where it's stacked quite heavily in favor of the employee. Terminations are pretty straightforward in the UK, particularly if they have less than 2 years of service. The process is even simpler if they have less than 2 years of service. Cost of employment. So I thought it'd be helpful to just explain what the total cost of employing somebody in the UK is, as in, what's the employer loading for Social Security, pension contributions and other things. So in the UK, the employer loading is about 20% of gross salary. So if you want to pay them 100, the cost to you as an employer will be in the region of 120. Time to first hire. This comes up so frequently for us. It's any employee can be hired fairly immediately in most countries, but when it comes to your first hire in a country where you don't have any infrastructure and you haven't made any registrations, it's quite helpful to understand how long does it take from pushing the button to actually being able to onboard that employee. So in the UK, it's almost instantaneous. You can employ somebody today, and we can take care of tax registrations and other things tomorrow. That's absolutely fine, and it is compliant with how things are done here in the UK. There aren't many country quirks for the UK, but we are on our way, or we have technically exited the EU, and there's still a lot of uncertainty, particularly around mobility of those who have previously enjoyed full mobility into the UK based on its membership of the EU. The difficulty score is really just intended as a guide for because there seems to be a strong correlation between how easy or difficult it is to do business in a country with how easy or difficult it is to employ. So for the UK, 8th globally, it is that's a good score. We are a simple in terms of doing business, a simple country to expand into, and a simple place to employ people. Next one, Andrew, is France. So France is often rolled out as the typically very complex, awful place to hire people. Employment law is complex. It does favour the employee, but with the appropriate advice and with good support. And as I say, we're very well versed and experienced in supporting our clients with employment and termination in France. With the right advice and the right support, that can be managed, and it's it's not a problem. It's not true to say there are those that say, well, you should never hire in France. That's not the case at all. As Andrew said, there are some fantastic talents and skills in France. I think it's more important to tap into the talent than it is to be too overly skeptical about the dangers posed by employment law. To that point, terminations are complex. Cost of employment is relatively high, 140, I might even say 145%. So the burden of social security in France sits mainly with the employer. Time to hire, so from pushing the button to being able to onboard the first employee, is longer. It takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So just be aware that if you want to hire somebody in a hurry, it's a good idea to start the process as early as you can, because registrations and other things need to be put into place. Country quirks, things that we've already referenced actually, which are collective bargaining agreements, language requirements, and the French employees typically quite litigious if things don't work out. So that's something to look out for. Difficulty score 32. So yes, it is a reasonably complex place to do business, and accordingly a fairly complex place to employ people as well. I think Germany is next. So employment law and Germany. So Germany, France, the UK are markets where we do an awful lot of work. In Germany, I would say the employment law is moderately in favour of the employee, but again, fairly balanced. Terminations are moderately complex, but they're not too bad. And I wouldn't say that the German employee is quite as litigious as the French or Spanish. Cost of employment is about 130% or a 30% uplift on gross salary. Time to hire is about 4 weeks, but it can be accelerated. So there are workarounds in Germany. We can get employees onboarded quicker than that with a couple of workarounds. The social security system is quite a unique part of German sort of employment and payroll, in that German employees have their own social security account, if you will, which they port from one employer to the next. And the burden of social security is actually about 40%. But it's split between employee and employer. So as an employer, you would burden about 20% of that. The employee themselves cover the other 20%, and that's the normal arrangement in Germany. Difficulty ranking of 22nd. So I think it's fair to say that it falls between the UK and France in terms of sort of general employment complexity. And the last one is Ireland, and we've added Ireland because Ireland is a popular choice, and if I'm honest, I think as the UK now exits from the EU, Ireland is again on the radar of tech companies as a great place to employ English speaking, good communication routes into the US and also into Europe, and it is being a member of the EU, it retains all the advantages of EU membership, which the UK is gradually shedding, regrettably, I say. So employment law, similar to the UK, it's quite well balanced. Terminations are quite straightforward. Cost of employment isn't too bad, 20% uplift. Time to first hire, it's very similar to the UK system, and we can get an employee onboarded virtually immediately. It's an unquirky country from a payroll and HR perspective. I don't think that the difficulty ranking does it justice. I think it's more straightforward than that. So that is an accelerated run through sort of employment law landscape in Europe, and hopefully just to flag to everybody why European employment law is portrayed and often typified as very complex, very difficult to deal with. It's not if you get the right advice, if you get the right guidance, and if you don't do that, then it can be fraught with risk and liability. But if it's well managed, it's a great place to do business. And as I say, we support a huge number of our clients with their European activities. Andrew, that's I think the last slide. So timed, I would say, to perfection, but we haven't really left any time for Q&A. But if we've got some questions, I think we could happily just entertain a couple of questions before we hit hit the end of the webinar.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I know we're a little pressed for time here, but if people want to hang on for some Q&A, I think that would be really helpful. So there is one question that came in. What do you mean exactly by country quirks? So that's kind of like things that are unique to those countries. Things that may be of particular interest. So like Julian was mentioning. The unique social security structure in Germany, for instance, or the kind of complex HR law in France. Just things that are unique to each country and not really a broad umbrella that applies to the EU. Julian, is that accurate? Or do you have anything else to add?
Absolutely right. I suppose another word for quirk would be oddity. So a country quirk or a country specific quirk is what is particularly unusual or particularly odd about that country or about the employment law landscape. So apologies for the use of the slightly slangy expression, but yeah, apologies for that. That's what we mean by country quirks.
Cool. And then another good one in here. Is there a risk to paying contractors and not having a local legal entity? And I think the main risk there is permanent establishment risk. There's a few criteria that kind of feed into what PE risk is, but that can really damage your brand and open your company up to liabilities. And the way we recommend mitigating that is by establishing a legal entity. But certainly there are other options that exist. It's really dependent on your circumstances, how large your team is, what kind of work they're doing. Anything to add on that, Julie?
Yeah. So whether a legal entity is technically required, it does depend on circumstances. How many employees do you have? What activity are they engaging in? And then we can determine whether there is a risk, a tax risk generally, and it is about tax and not really about HR or employment law. Excuse me. So I lost my train of thought. I apologize, but certain activity is better suited, or employment without a legal entity is fine for certain types of activity, and then there are grey areas in between where one could argue that there should be a legal entity, and on the other hand, you could argue that there shouldn't. And that grey area is really the piece that usually requires a bit of support. And again, that's something we advise a lot of our clients on: is what is the risk of employing this person or these people in this country with or without a legal entity? And usually we get to a fine compromise or an agreement with our client based on their attitude to. Frankly, it's it's a compromise between risk and cost, and that's usually what the factors that play a part in concluding the situation.
A more quick one would be, which countries are currently popular spots for U.S. firms to hire in Europe?
Yeah, sure. I'll take that one, Andrew, if that's okay. So despite the Brexit, which everybody thankfully isn't talked about quite so much, but it's regrettable that other things have taken the headlines. The UK remains a really popular place for, particularly for US companies, to hire as a first footfall in Europe. Brexit does have an impact for some types of business and doesn't have any impact at all for other types of business. And as long as a company understands where it falls on that spectrum, then the UK can continue to be the location of choice for first footfalls into Europe. So the UK is still popular. Germany and France have always been popular. They continue to be popular. Germany is a big economy. France is a big economy. Very skilled workforces. Central to, or more central than the UK to Europe. Great opportunities, sort of commercial opportunities in those countries across the board. Spain is also very popular. What we're seeing is that there are the general level of engineering skills, particularly in Spain and Portugal, are very high. And so we have an increasing number of clients coming to us and asking us for help with establishing engineering centres in Portugal and Spain for them. So that's an interesting one as well. I think those are the main ones. And then there are the usual, what I would consider perhaps from our point of view to be secondary. Still lots of interest in Italy, the Netherlands, the Nordics as a whole, and also Ireland. So I think that probably answers the question.
Another couple that came in here, but I'm going to have, I know we're pushed up against time here, but I do want to address those. So I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen here. I'll respond to you separately on email as well if you reached out in the chat. But yeah, if you have any specific questions, thanks everyone for joining. But feel free to reach out to me either by phone or email. Like I said, I'm based on the West Coast in the US here, but we've got pretty much all time zones covered since we're a UK company as well. So feel free to reach out. Thanks for joining, and really appreciate everyone's attention.
Thank you, everybody.